The knife was already at her throat when Elira Voss opened her eyes. She did not scream. Screaming was for people who still believed someone would come running. Instead, she went still, the way a hunted animal goes still, and let her gaze slide sideways to the man holding the blade. He was young, maybe 20, with the jittery eyes of someone who had never done this before and was regretting it already. "Don't move," he said, though his own hand was shaking more than she was. Elira lay back against the cold stone of the alley wall behind the tanner's shop, the one place in Thornwood where the moonlight never quite reached, and did the thing she had trained herself to do for 7 years. She waited. She watched. She let the silence stretch until it worked in her favor instead of his. "You're the scarred one," the boy said, as if this explained everything. "Nobody will come looking for you. Nobody will care." He was wrong, but she let him believe he was right, because a man who believes he holds all the power makes mistakes. His grip loosened by a fraction as he leaned in to study her face in the dark, curious despite himself about the mark that had made her a ghost in her own pack. That fraction was enough. Elira drove her knee up hard and twisted free, rolling away across the packed dirt before he could recover his balance. She was on her feet and running before he even understood what had happened, her bare feet slapping against stone, her heart pounding a war drum against her ribs. Behind her, she heard him curse and give chase, but fear had already given her the one advantage that mattered most in Thornwood: speed. She did not stop running until she reached the old well at the edge of the packlands, the place where the trees grew thick enough to swallow moonlight whole. There she pressed her back against the well's cracked stone rim and finally let herself breathe. This was her life. Not a rare, terrible night, but an ordinary hazard of being a woman the pack had already decided was worthless. 7 years ago, a rogue wolf's claws had opened her cheek during an attack no one else survived to explain, and the healers had done what they could, which had not been enough. The scar ran from her temple to the corner of her jaw, pale and permanent, a signature written across her face by violence. In most packs, an unmarked face was a woman's entire value. Beauty meant alliances. Beauty meant a strong alpha would want her, would claim her, would bind her to his side and, in exchange, bind her family to his protection. Elira's scar had erased all of that in a single night. No alpha wanted a mate whose face reminded him of misfortune. No pack elder wasted breath negotiating a match for a woman already considered damaged. For a long time, Elira had cried over this. She no longer did. Because somewhere in the wreckage of that night, she had discovered something the rest of Thornwood never guessed. An unclaimed woman could not be traded. She could not be handed from one alpha's bed to another like a piece of furniture passed between houses. She could not be forced into a mating ceremony to settle a debt her father owed, or married off to seal a peace treaty between quarreling packs. She was, in the cruelest possible way, free. So Elira had learned to disappear. She kept her hair long and loose, letting it fall over the left side of her face. She kept her eyes down in the market. She lived in the smallest house at the edge of pack territory, took in mending work from families too polite to comment on her scar to her face, and told herself that invisibility was its own kind of peace. Tonight had reminded her that peace built on invisibility was fragile. A boy with a shaking hand had almost proven that being unclaimed did not mean being untouchable. It only meant no one would come running when trouble found her. She pushed off from the well and started the long walk home, her arms wrapped around herself against the night chill. The forest around Thornwood was usually quiet this time of year, but tonight it felt charged, as if the trees themselves were listening for something. She told herself it was only her nerves catching up with her, the leftover fear from the alley still rattling through her blood. She was wrong. By the time she reached the edge of the village square, she could already hear the commotion. Torches burned along the main road, more of them than she had ever seen lit at once, and pack members stood in clusters, speaking in low, urgent voices. Elira slowed her steps, pulling her hair further over her scar out of old habit, and moved close enough to catch fragments of conversation. "Says he's already crossed the northern border. Taking every pack under one crown, that's what I heard. The Alpha King himself, coming here, to Thornwood." Elira's stomach tightened. She had heard whispers of the Alpha King for months now, the way everyone had. Cale Ashgrave. a name spoken with equal parts awe and dread across every territory in the region. He had risen out of the ashes of his own pack's betrayal 3 years ago, when rivals he had once called brothers turned on him in a single bloody night. Where lesser wolves would have broken, Kale had rebuilt himself into something colder and far more dangerous. Pack after pack had fallen under his authority since, some through negotiation, most through the simple, terrifying fact that no one dared stand against him. Now, apparently, he was coming here. Illyra slipped through the crowd toward home, her mind racing. An Alpha King's visit meant ceremony. It meant every unmated wolf in the pack would be expected to present themselves, to be seen, to be considered. It meant elders combing through every household, making sure no eligible woman or man was left hidden away in shadow. It meant, for the first time in 7 years, that Illyra might not be allowed to disappear. She reached her small house at the edge of the woods and shut the door behind her, leaning against it as her breath came fast and uneven. Through the thin walls, she could still hear distant voices from the square, excited, nervous, alive with the electricity of an event that would reshape the pack's future. Illyra slid down until she was sitting on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, and touched the scar along her cheek, the way she sometimes did in private moments, tracing its ridge with 2 fingers. It did not hurt anymore, not physically. The pain it caused now was quieter and lived somewhere else entirely. They won't want you, she reminded herself, the way she had reminded herself 100 times before. Nothing has changed, but something had. She could feel it, the way animals feel a storm coming long before the first cloud appears on the horizon. 7 years of careful invisibility were about to be tested by a man whose reputation suggested he noticed everything and forgave nothing. She did not sleep well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the boy's shaking hand holding the knife, and behind him, faceless in her imagination, a taller shadow she could not yet put a name to, watching her the way no one in Thornwood had watched her in 7 long years. The next morning, the pack elders came to every door in Thornwood, and when they reached hers, they did not simply knock and move on the way they usually did. They knocked, and they waited for her to answer. Elder Corwin stood on her step with 2 younger pack members flanking him, his expression carrying the particular blend of duty and discomfort that Illyra had come to recognize whenever anyone had to deal with her directly. He held a scroll in one hand, the pack's ceremonial seal pressed into red wax at its edge. "Illyra Voss," he said, formal in a way he had never bothered to be with her before. "By order of the Pack Council, all unmated wolves within Thornwood territory are required to attend the Alpha's inspection 3 days from now, upon the arrival of Alpha King Kale Ashgrave." Illyra's fingers tightened on the edge of the door. "I don't need to attend," she said carefully. "Everyone already knows my situation." Corwin's eyes flicked, just for a moment. To the side of her face she kept turned away from him, and then back to her eyes. "The order is not optional. Every unmated wolf, no exceptions, regardless of..." He paused, searching for a word that would not sound cruel, and failing to find one. "Regardless of circumstance." "And if I refuse?" "Then you dishonor the pack in front of a man who could decide our future with a single word," Corwin said, his voice dropping lower. "Illyra, I understand this is not easy for you, but the king's visit is bigger than any one person's comfort. Thornwood cannot afford to be seen as disorganized, or as hiding something from him. Attend the inspection. Stand at the back if you must, but you will attend." He did not wait for her agreement before turning and walking to the next house, the scroll already unrolling in his hand for its next reading. Illyra closed the door slowly, her heart hammering in a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear of knives or shadowed alleys, and everything to do with a different kind of exposure. For 7 years, she had built a life around not being seen. In 3 days, an Alpha King, with the power to reshape her entire world, would look directly at her, whether she wanted him to or not. She spent that afternoon at the small market stall, where she traded her mending work for coin, her hands moving through the familiar motions of folding cloth while her mind turned over every possible way to avoid what was coming. She could feign illness. She could disappear into the deep woods until the inspection passed. She could beg one of the few pack members who tolerated her, an older woman named Nadia who ran the herb stand, to speak on her behalf. None of it would work, and she knew it. The Pack Council had never cared about her comfort before. They would not begin now, not with an Alpha King watching to see how well Thornwood managed its own affairs. "You look like you're planning a war," Nadia said from behind her stand, watching Elira fold the same piece of fabric for the third time without noticing. "I might be," Elira admitted. Nadia's expression softened. She was one of the only people in Thornwood who had never flinched at Elira's scar, who spoke to her the way she might speak to anyone else, without pity dressing up her words. "The inspection," she said. It was not a question. Elira nodded. "You could hide the scar better," Nadia offered gently. "There are ways. Ash paste, if you mix it right, can dull the color. Or you could wear your hair differently, cover more of your face without it looking deliberate." "Everyone already knows what's under my hair," Elira said. "Hiding it now would just make it worse, like I'm ashamed." "Are you?" The question landed harder than Nadia probably intended. Elira opened her mouth to answer automatically, the way she always did, with some version of the truth she had told herself for 7 years, that the scar had given her freedom, that she did not need anyone's approval, that being unclaimed was a gift disguised as a curse. But for the first time, the words felt thin in her mouth, worn down from overuse. "I don't know anymore," she admitted quietly. Nadia reached across the stand and squeezed her hand, just once, before a customer approached and the moment passed. But the question stayed with Elira for the rest of the day, following her home through the darkening woods like a second shadow. That night, she stood in front of the small, cracked mirror she kept in her bedroom and looked at herself properly for the first time in longer than she could remember. She usually avoided this, catching only glimpses while braiding her hair or washing her face, never allowing herself the full, unhurried study most people took for granted. Her reflection looked back at her steadily. Dark hair, currently loose around her shoulders, eyes the color of strong tea, sharp and watchful from years of practice, and along the left side of her face, from temple to jaw, the pale ridge of scar tissue that had rewritten the entire course of her life. She traced it with one finger, the way she often did, but this time she made herself look, really look. Instead of glancing away, the moment discomfort rose in her chest. It was not ugly, she realized, studying it with something closer to curiosity than shame. It was simply there, a fact of her face, like the shape of her nose, or the arch of her eyebrows. The horror other people projected onto it had never actually lived in the mark itself. It lived in their reactions, and she had spent 7 years absorbing those reactions, as if they were truths about her own worth. 3 days, she thought, watching her reflection's steady, unflinching eyes. 3 days until an Alpha King looked at her the way everyone else in Thornwood had, and confirmed, once and for all, that she was exactly what the Pack had always told her she was. She did not yet know that 3 days from now, everything she believed about herself was about to be proven wrong. The morning of the Alpha King's arrival came gray and heavy with mist, the kind of weather that made the whole Pack territory feel like it was holding its breath. Elira woke before dawn, unable to sleep any longer, and lay staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, while the household sounds of Thornwood slowly built outside her window, footsteps hurrying past, voices calling instructions to each other. The distant, rhythmic pounding of hammers as the last preparations were made in the village square. By mid-morning, the entire Pack had gathered near the central hall, a stone building large enough to hold ceremonies, but never quite large enough to hold the nervous energy of an entire Pack, anticipating its ruler's arrival. Elira stood near the back of the crowd, as far from the center as she could manage without drawing attention, her hair arranged carefully over the left side of her face. She felt every second stretch unbearably long. Then, without warning, the crowd's low murmur cut off entirely, replaced by a silence so complete that Elira could hear her own pulse in her ears. She followed everyone else's gaze toward the northern road, where a procession had emerged from the mist. At its head rode a man who did not need a crown to announce who he was. Cale Ashgrave moved through the fog like something the world itself had made room for. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of wolves who spent more time fighting than resting, with dark hair cropped close, and eyes the pale gray of a winter sky just before snow. He wore no ceremonial finery, Nothing gaudy or showy, only dark, practical clothing that somehow made him look more dangerous than any amount of gold ever could have. He did not smile. He did not wave. He simply rode forward with the unshakable calm of a man who had never once doubted that a room would arrange itself around him the moment he entered it. Illyra felt something in her chest tighten, an instinct older than reason, and she was not the only one. The entire crowd seemed to lean back half a step as he drew closer, as if some collective animal sense recognized the presence of a true predator among them. Beside him rode a smaller retinue, warriors and advisors whose names Illyra did not know and did not care to learn. Her attention stayed fixed on the king himself, unable to look away even as every instinct told her to make herself small, to blend into the crowd, to become invisible the way she had trained herself to be for 7 long years. Cale dismounted at the center of the square, with an economy of motion that suggested he wasted nothing, not even effort. Elder Corwin hurried forward to greet him, with the elaborate courtesy reserved for men whose displeasure could end a pack's entire future, and Cale listened to the welcome with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. "Thornwood is honored by your presence, Alpha King," Corwin said, bowing low. "I have little interest in honor," Cale replied, his voice low and even, carrying easily across the silent square. "I am here to see what this pack has to offer the unified territories, nothing more." His gaze swept over the assembled crowd as he spoke, cataloging faces with a coldness that made even seasoned warriors shift uncomfortably. Illyra watched his eyes move across the square and told herself, firmly, that there was no reason for her heart to be pounding this hard. He was not looking for her specifically. He did not know she existed. In a crowd this size, she was exactly what she had always been, invisible. "The inspection will proceed at midday," Corwin announced to the gathered pack, his voice carrying the practiced formality of ceremony. "All unmated wolves will present themselves before the Alpha King." Illyra's stomach dropped. Midday was only hours away. She spent those hours in a state of quiet dread, going through the motions of an ordinary morning, while her mind raced through every possible outcome of what was to come. She helped Nadia prepare herbs at the market stall, her hands shaking slightly as she measured out dried leaves. She avoided conversation, avoided eye contact, avoided anything that might draw attention before she absolutely had to face it. When the bell finally rang, calling every unmated wolf to the central hall, Illyra felt the sound land in her chest like a physical blow. She joined the line of young women and men making their way toward the hall, all of them dressed in their finest available clothing, hair carefully arranged, postures straightened with hope or nerves or both. Illyra wore the same simple dress she always wore, her hair loose over the left side of her face, and felt more out of place among her own pack than she ever had in 7 years of careful invisibility. Inside the hall, Cale Ashgrave sat at the front on a simple wooden chair that had clearly been hastily arranged to serve as a throne for the occasion, flanked by Elder Corwin and several pack officials. His pale gray eyes moved across each person as they were called forward, assessing, cataloging, giving nothing away. One by one, the unmated wolves of Thornwood stepped forward to be introduced. Some hoped, quietly and desperately, that the Alpha King might see something in them worth claiming, worth elevating beyond their current standing. Others simply endured the process as one more obligation of pack life, their eyes already sliding toward the exit before their turn had even finished. Illyra stood near the back of the line, watching the process unfold with a growing, cold certainty that when her name was called, this would be different. Not because Cale would want her. She held no illusions on that front, but because someone, eventually, would notice her trying not to be noticed, and that itself would become its own kind of spectacle. She was right. "Illyra Voss," Corwin called out, reading from his list, and then paused, his eyes finding her at the back of the hall with an expression she recognized immediately as reluctance. The room's attention shifted toward her, dozens of eyes turning in unison, and Illyra felt every instinct she possessed screaming at her to run. She did not run. She walked forward instead, slowly, her chin lifted despite the trembling she refused to let show in her hands, and felt the weight of the entire pack's attention pressing against her like a physical force. Whispers rippled through the crowd behind her, low and quick. the kind of murmurs that needed no words to convey their meaning. The scarred one, the unclaimed one. Why is she even here? Elira stopped at the appropriate distance before the Alpha King's makeshift throne, and, following the custom she had watched every other unmated wolf perform before her, lowered her head in the expected bow of respect. She did not lift it again immediately. For a long moment, the hall was utterly silent, and Elira became acutely aware of her own heartbeat, of the mist-damp air, of the weight of her own hair falling forward to shield the left side of her face, exactly as it had for 7 careful years. Then, quietly, Elder Corwin cleared his throat. "Alpha King," he said, his voice pitched low but not quite low enough to avoid carrying through the silent hall. "This is Elira Voss. She has been unmated for some years now, due to circumstance." Elira felt her face heat with humiliation, even as she kept her head bowed, kept herself perfectly, carefully still. "Lift your head," came a voice she had not yet heard speak directly to her. It was low, even, and carried an authority that made refusal feel physically impossible. Elira's whole body went rigid. Around her, she felt more than heard the crowd's collective intake of breath, everyone recognizing that something unusual was happening, though none of them could have said exactly what. Slowly, Elira lifted her head. She met Cale Ashgrave's pale gray eyes directly, refusing, out of pure stubborn pride, to look away, or down, or anywhere but straight ahead, and for the first time in 7 years, she did not immediately turn her face to hide the scarred side from a stranger's gaze. Something shifted in the Alpha King's expression. It was subtle, barely perceptible to anyone not watching closely, but Elira was close enough to see it happen. His eyes, cold and assessing a moment before, narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in something closer to sudden, sharp attention. His gaze moved deliberately across her face, lingering on the pale ridge of scar tissue along her cheek, with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The hall remained silent, waiting. "Your name again?" Cale said, his voice quieter now, though it still carried through the room. "Elira Voss," she repeated, proud of how steady her own voice sounded, despite the chaos happening beneath her ribs. Cale did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her, at the scar she had spent 7 years learning to hide, and had, in this single unguarded moment, forgotten entirely to conceal, and something unreadable passed behind his pale eyes. "You may step back," he said finally, his tone giving away nothing. Elira bowed again, more out of habit than intention, and retreated to the back of the hall on legs that felt unsteady beneath her. The inspection continued around her, more names called, more unmated wolves stepping forward and stepping back, but Elira barely registered any of it. She could still feel the weight of the Alpha King's gaze on her scarred cheek, and for reasons she could not name and did not want to examine too closely, the feeling did not fade for the rest of the day. That night, long after the inspection had ended and the pack had scattered back to their homes to gossip and speculate about the king's intentions, Elira sat awake in her small house, unable to settle her racing thoughts. Something had happened in that hall, something she could not fully explain, and she did not know whether to be afraid of it or something else entirely, something she had no experience naming because she had never once, in 7 long years, allowed herself to want anything a claiming might bring. Outside her window, the mist had thickened into a low, silver fog that swallowed the moonlight whole, and somewhere beyond it, in the guest quarters the pack had hastily prepared, the Alpha King sat awake as well, turning over in his mind an image he could not shake. A scarred face lifted without shame, dark eyes meeting his without flinching, and a strange, unfamiliar pull in his chest that felt disturbingly, unmistakably like recognition. Neither of them slept well that night, and neither of them yet understood that the quiet, careful lives they had each built for themselves were about to be unmade. Cale Ashgrave had not come to Thornwood looking for anything except order. That had been the plan since he crossed the northern border 3 days ago, and it remained the plan the morning after the inspection, when he woke before dawn in the small guest quarters the pack had prepared for him, and found his thoughts circling, against his will, back to a scarred face lifted without shame. He told himself it meant nothing. In 3 years of unifying territories under his rule, He had seen hundreds of unmated wolves paraded before him, each one hoping for an alliance, a claiming, a chance at status they had not earned. He had learned to look at all of them the same way, as pieces on a board, useful or not, nothing more. Sentiment had no place in what he was building. Sentiment was what had gotten his first pack burned to the ground 3 years ago, when men he had called brothers decided his trust made him weak enough to betray. And yet, he rose and dressed in the gray pre-dawn light, his mind returning, uninvited, to the moment Alira Voss had lifted her head. Most people who bore visible wounds learned to angle their faces away from scrutiny, to soften the impact of what strangers might see. She had done the opposite. She had looked at him directly, the scar fully exposed, and had not flinched once under the weight of his attention. It was not the scar itself that had caught him. Cale had seen far worse wounds on far stronger wolves. It was the way she wore it, not with shame, and not quite with pride either, but with something more complicated, a kind of armor built out of necessity that had hardened, over time, into identity. He recognized that particular hardness. He had built the same kind himself, out of very different wreckage. By mid-morning, Cale found himself walking the perimeter of Thornwood's territory alone, having dismissed his usual retinue on the pretense of wanting to assess the pack's borders personally. It was, technically, true. It was also, less technically, an excuse to think without an audience. His path took him past the market square, where pack members were setting up their morning stalls, and it was there, entirely by accident, that he saw her again. Alira stood at a small mending stall beside an older woman with silver-streaked hair, her attention fixed on a piece of torn fabric in her hands, needle moving in quick, practiced stitches. She had her hair arranged carefully over the left side of her face again, back to the careful concealment he had disrupted the day before, and something about seeing her retreat back into hiding bothered him more than he expected. He did not approach her, not yet. Instead, he watched from a distance, cataloging details the way he cataloged everything, the steadiness of her hands, despite whatever nervous energy lived beneath her calm expression, the way other pack members gave her stall a wide berth, speaking to the older woman beside her but never quite meeting Alira's eyes, the small, private smile that crossed her face when a child ran past and waved at her without hesitation, unburdened by the adult world's careful cruelty. She was watched by everyone in Thornwood, Cale realized, and seen by almost none of them. That evening, Elder Corwin requested a private audience with the Alpha King, ostensibly to discuss the formal terms of Thornwood's integration into the unified territories. Cale agreed, expecting the usual tedious negotiations over resources, borders, and tribute. Instead, partway through the discussion, he found himself asking a question that had nothing to do with any of it. "Tell me about the scarred woman," he said, cutting Corwin off mid-sentence about grain allocations. "Alira Voss." Corwin blinked, visibly thrown by the shift. "Alira? There is little to tell. Alpha King. She was attacked by a rogue wolf 7 years ago, during an incident that claimed several lives. She survived, but the injury left her." He gestured vaguely toward his own face. "Marked. Since then, she has lived a quiet life at the edge of the territory. Unmated, obviously. No family remains to advocate for her. Her parents died in the same attack that scarred her. No family," Cale repeated. "None to speak of. She survives on mending work and whatever charity the pack extends to her, which I confess has grown thin over the years. She is not disruptive. She causes no trouble. But she holds no real place in Thornwood's future, if I am honest with you." Corwin hesitated, clearly uncertain why the Alpha King had taken any interest in the subject at all. "May I ask why you inquire, Alpha King?" "You may not," Cale said, and returned the conversation to grain allocations before Corwin could press further. But the question stayed with him long after Corwin left, and that night, unable to settle into sleep, Cale found himself walking the edges of Thornwood's territory again, this time with a destination in mind he had not fully admitted to himself until his feet were already carrying him there. Alira's small house sat at the edge of the woods, a single window glowing with candlelight against the deepening dark. Cale stopped a distance away, hidden in the tree line, and told himself this was simple curiosity, nothing more. the same careful assessment he applied to every asset and liability within a newly acquired territory. He was still telling himself that, when the candlelight inside the house moved, and Alira's silhouette crossed the window, and something in his chest tightened in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with strategy. He left before she could notice him watching, troubled by his own behavior in a way he had not been troubled by anything in a very long time. The following day, Cale requested a formal tour of Thornwood's territory, ostensibly to assess its resources and defenses, before finalizing the terms of its integration. Elder Corwin, eager to please, assigned several senior pack members to guide him, but Cale dismissed most of them within the first hour, citing a preference for a smaller escort. By midday, through a series of deliberate questions that seemed innocuous on their surface, he had maneuvered the tour toward the market square, and from there, toward the mending stall, where Alira worked. She looked up when his shadow fell across her table, and Cale watched her expression shift through several stages in rapid succession: surprise, wariness, and finally, the same careful, guarded neutrality she seemed to wear as armor around most of the pack. "Alpha King," she said, rising and offering a shallow bow, her hair falling forward to shield the left side of her face as she moved. "Don't," Cale said, before he had fully decided to speak at all. Alira froze, halfway through straightening. "Don't what?" "Hide it," he said, gesturing vaguely toward her face. "There's no need. I've already seen it." A flush of something that might have been anger or might have been embarrassment colored Alira's cheeks. "With respect, Alpha King, what I choose to do with my own hair is not a matter for your consideration." The retort surprised him. Most people in his presence chose their words with elaborate, exhausting care, terrified of causing offense to a man who held their entire pack's future in his hands. Alira had simply told him, plainly, that he had overstepped. Cale found himself almost amused. "You're right," he admitted. "I apologize." Alira blinked, clearly not expecting an apology from the Alpha King, any more than she had expected his attention in the first place. "That's unexpected," she said carefully. "I've been told I have that effect," Cale said, and for the briefest moment, something in his expression softened into what might, in a less guarded man, have been the beginning of a smile. Nadia, watching this exchange from beside her herb stand with undisguised curiosity, cleared her throat pointedly. "Is there something we can help you with, Alpha King?" Cale's attention returned to the present task, though reluctantly. "I'm assessing the territory's resources," he said. "I understand this stall provides mending services to much of the pack." "It does," Alira said, some of her wariness returning now that the conversation had shifted to safer ground. "Cloth is difficult to come by out here, so most families prefer to repair what they have, rather than replace it." "Show me your work," Cale said. It was an unusual request, and Alira's eyebrows lifted slightly, before she reached for a nearly finished piece, a child's tunic she had been repairing that morning, and held it out for his inspection. Cale took it, turning it over in his hands, examining the stitching with more genuine attention than the request probably warranted. The work was meticulous, small even stitches that had reinforced the fabric so thoroughly the repair was barely visible, a skill that spoke of years of careful practice. "This is good work," he said, and meant it. "Thank you," Alira said, something cautious and unfamiliar flickering across her face, as if praise from any direction, let alone from an Alpha King, was an experience she had little practice receiving gracefully. Cale handed the tunic back to her, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange, and felt something electric pass between them at the contact, quick and startling enough that both of them pulled back a fraction faster than the moment strictly required. Alira's eyes widened slightly. Cale's jaw tightened. Neither of them spoke of it, but neither of them quite managed to look away from the other for several long, charged seconds afterward, until Corwin's voice broke the moment, calling for the Alpha King's attention regarding the northern grazing fields. Cale excused himself with more reluctance than the situation warranted, and continued his tour, though his mind kept circling back, again and again, to the strange current that had passed between his fingers and Alira's, and to the question he had no framework for answering. He was a king who had sworn off sentiment entirely after his first pack's betrayal. He did not believe in fate, or destiny, or any of the soft, foolish notions that made wolves weak enough to be exploited. And yet something ancient and instinctive, buried deep beneath 3 years of careful, deliberate control, had recognized something in Alira Voss that his rational mind could not yet name. That night, he summoned his senior advisor, a sharp-eyed man named Bram, who had served him since the earliest days of rebuilding his power, and asked a question he had never once needed to ask, in 3 years of claiming territory after territory. "Bram," he said, staring into the fire of his temporary quarters, "have you ever heard of a mating bond forming without warning, between an alpha and a wolf he had no prior connection to?" Bram's eyebrows rose sharply. "It happens, Alpha King, though rarely, and rarer still among wolves of no established bloodline. Why do you ask?" Kale did not answer immediately, his thoughts still tangled around the sensation of Alira's fingers brushing his, the sharp, electric jolt that had followed. "No reason," he said finally. "Simple curiosity." Bram, wisely, did not press further, though the look he gave his king suggested he did not entirely believe the dismissal. Left alone with his thoughts once more, Kale found himself thinking, unwillingly, about the particular way Alira's dark eyes had held his, without flinching during the inspection, about the quiet dignity with which she carried a wound the rest of her pack had decided defined her entire worth, and about the growing, uncomfortable certainty that whatever was happening to him had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with something he had spent 3 years convincing himself he no longer had the capacity to feel. Across the village, in her small house at the edge of the woods, Alira sat awake with her own tangled thoughts, replaying the moment Kale's fingers had brushed hers, the strange warmth that had traveled up her arm and settled somewhere deep in her chest, and the unsettling realization that for the first time in 7 years, she had wanted someone to look at her scar, and had not, in that moment, felt any need to hide it at all. She told herself it meant nothing. He was the Alpha King, passing through, assessing territory, nothing more. In a matter of days he would move on to the next pack, the next negotiation, and Thornwood would return to its usual rhythms, and she would return to her usual invisibility, and this strange electric feeling would fade into memory like everything else eventually did. She almost believed it. But sleep, when it finally came, was restless and full of pale gray eyes that refused to look away, and when she woke the next morning, the memory of his hand against hers had not faded at all. If anything, it had grown sharper, more insistent, a splinter lodged somewhere beneath her ribs that she could not quite work free. Neither of them yet understood that the bond forming between them was not the ordinary, gradual kind that built slowly over months of courtship and careful negotiation. It was the rare, sudden kind, the kind spoken of only in old stories passed down through generations, the kind that arrived without warning and refused, once ignited, to be extinguished by either party's careful, deliberate resistance. And somewhere beneath the pale, unremarkable scar on Alira Voss's cheek, hidden by 7 years of trauma and misunderstanding, lay a truth neither of them had yet discovered, a truth that would, within days, unravel everything both of them believed they knew about who they were, and who they were meant to become. 3 days after the inspection, Elder Corwin summoned Alira to the central hall with no explanation, only a terse note delivered by a nervous pack runner who refused to meet her eyes. Alira read the note twice, searching for some clue about what she had done wrong, some infraction she might need to prepare a defense against. Summons like this rarely meant anything good for someone in her position. She dressed carefully, tied her hair back rather than leaving it loose, and walked to the central hall with her heart beating an anxious rhythm against her ribs. She did not expect to find the hall empty, except for the Alpha King himself, seated at a small table near the window, a stack of old pack records spread before him. "You sent for me?" Alira asked from the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or wait for permission. Kale looked up, and something in his expression shifted, softened almost imperceptibly, before settling back into the careful neutrality he seemed to wear as his own kind of armor. "Come in," he said. "Close the door." Alira hesitated, every instinct honed by 7 years of caution, telling her to be careful, but she stepped inside and closed the door as instructed, standing near it with her hands folded in front of her. "I've been reviewing Thornwood's old records," Kale said, gesturing toward the stack of papers before him. Births, deaths, bloodlines, going back several generations. It's standard procedure when I integrate a new territory. I need to understand the pack's history before I can properly govern it. That seems reasonable, Elira said, though she still did not understand why this required her presence. I found something, Kale continued, regarding the attack that happened 7 years ago, the one that killed your parents. Elira's spine stiffened. I don't see why that's relevant to territorial records. Because the records describe more than just the attack itself, Kale said, his gray eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, and refuse to give him that satisfaction, both at once. They describe your bloodline, Elira, your mother's family, specifically. My mother's family is dead, Elira said, her voice flatter than she intended. There's nothing left to describe. Your mother's family, Kale said carefully, descended from the first bloodline. The line that founded the earliest packs, before the territories fractured into what they are now. It's a lineage most people believe died out generations ago. Elira stared at him, uncomprehending. That's not possible. My mother was a healer's daughter. Nothing more. Healers often descended from the old bloodlines, Kale said. The gift for healing ran strongest in families who carried first bloodline blood, even generations removed from any formal recognition of it. It's not a coincidence, Elira. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in the old records, if you know what to look for. Even if that's true, Elira said, still struggling to understand why any of this mattered now, 7 years too late to matter to the parents who had died with whatever secret they carried. What does it have to do with me? Kale rose from the table and crossed the room toward her, slow and deliberate, and Elira felt her pulse quicken with something that was not quite fear, though it lived close enough to fear's neighborhood to be confusing. First bloodline descendants carry a mark, he said, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. A sigil, hidden beneath the skin, that only reveals itself under specific circumstances. Trauma is one of them. Elira's hand rose involuntarily to her scarred cheek, understanding, beginning to dawn even as she resisted it. You think my scar is hiding this mark? I think, Kale said quietly, that the wound covering your bloodline's sigil is the reason no one in 7 years has recognized what you actually are. And what am I, according to you? Elira asked, her voice barely above a whisper now, caught between disbelief and a strange, dangerous hope she did not trust herself to feel. May I look? Kale asked, instead of answering directly, closely. I need to be certain before I say anything further. Elira's whole body went rigid at the request. 7 years of careful concealment screamed at her to refuse, to step back, to put distance between herself and a man asking permission to examine the wound she had spent so long hiding from the world. But something else, something quieter and more insistent, told her that this moment mattered in ways she did not yet fully understand, and that refusing to face it now would cost her something she could not afford to lose. She nodded, once, and did not step back. Kale raised his hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and when she did not, he brushed her hair back from the left side of her face, with a gentleness that surprised her, tucking it behind her ear, so the full length of her scar lay exposed to the afternoon light, streaming through the hall's window. His fingers were warm against her skin, and Elira held perfectly still, her breath shallow, as he studied the scar with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time in 7 years, less like a wound, and more like something worth careful attention. There, Kale said softly, his thumb tracing, with impossible gentleness, a faint pattern beneath the raised ridge of scar tissue that Elira had never noticed herself, hidden as it was beneath the more obvious damage. Do you feel that? Elira did feel it, a warmth spreading beneath his touch that had nothing to do with simple skin contact, a kind of recognition that seemed to rise up from somewhere deep inside her, as if some dormant part of herself was finally waking after 7 long years of sleep. What is it? She breathed. The sigil of the first bloodline, Kale said, his voice rough with something she could not quite identify. Hidden by your scar for 7 years. Elira, you're not what this pack has told you that you are. You never were. Elira's eyes filled with tears she did not fully understand, 7 years of carefully constructed identity cracking open all at once. "I don't understand," she whispered. "If this is true, why has no one ever seen it? Why did no healer notice, in 7 years of treating this wound?" "Because the sigil only responds to certain things," Kale said. "Deep trauma can trigger it. And so, according to the old records, can the touch of someone bonded to you by fate." The word hung between them, heavy with implication neither of them had yet spoken aloud. "Bonded," Elira repeated slowly. "I felt it," Kale admitted, and something in his careful, controlled expression cracked open, revealing an uncertainty she had not expected to see in a man of his reputation. "When our hands touched at the market stall. I've spent 3 years convinced I no longer had the capacity to feel anything like that, Elira. I told myself it meant nothing, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since." Elira's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "I felt it too," she admitted, the words escaping before caution could stop them. "I told myself the same thing." Kale's hand remained where it was, resting gently along the line of her scarred cheek, and the space between them seemed to shrink, without either of them consciously deciding to close it. Elira could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the careful control in his gray eyes finally beginning to slip, replaced by something raw and unguarded that she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to witness. "I should step back," Kale said, though he made no move to do so. "This isn't why I came to Thornwood. I have no business claiming anything, let alone a bond I never asked for." "But you're not stepping back," Elira observed, her own voice barely above a whisper. "No," Kale admitted. "I'm not." He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to move away, to refuse, to end whatever was happening between them, before it went any further. Elira did not move away. Instead, she found herself leaning almost imperceptibly toward him, 7 years of careful self-protection giving way, in this single unguarded moment, to something she had never once allowed herself to want. Kale's lips brushed against her scarred cheek, gentle and reverent, pressing a kiss directly against the mark that had defined and diminished her for 7 long years, the mark that had just been revealed to hold not shame, but royal blood, not damage, but destiny hidden in plain sight. The moment his lips touched her scar, something ignited between them, a warmth that spread through Elira's entire body like sunlight breaking through storm clouds after years of gray weather. She gasped softly, her hand rising instinctively to grip the front of his shirt, steadying herself against a sensation she had no prior experience to compare it to. Beneath his touch, the faint pattern of the hidden sigil seemed to warm and pulse, as if recognizing, finally, after 7 years of dormant silence, the touch of someone bonded to it by forces older than either of them understood. Kale pulled back slightly, though he did not release her, his forehead resting gently against hers, as they both struggled to steady their breathing. "That," he said quietly, "was not supposed to happen." "No," Elira agreed, equally breathless. "It wasn't." "Do you regret it?" he asked, and for the first time since she had met him, Kale Ashgrave, Alpha King of the Unified Territories, sounded genuinely uncertain of an answer. Elira considered the question honestly, searching her own racing heart for the truth. 7 years of careful invisibility, of choosing isolation over the risk of rejection, of building an entire identity around a wound she had never fully understood, all of it felt, in this moment, like armor she had outgrown without realizing it. "No," she said finally, meeting his pale gray eyes without flinching, exactly as she had during the inspection 3 days earlier, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "I don't regret it." Something in Kale's expression eased, tension he had likely been carrying since the moment their hands first touched finally releasing. He reached up and traced the scar along her cheek once more, this time slowly, deliberately, as if committing the shape of it to memory. "I need to understand what this means," he said, "for you, for your bloodline, for what happens next. This isn't a small thing, Elira. If the pack learns what you truly are, everything about your life is going to change, whether you're prepared for it or not." Elira's stomach tightened at the reminder that whatever was happening between them existed within a much larger, more dangerous context than the quiet privacy of this room. The pack has spent 7 years deciding what I am, based on nothing more than a scar, she said. I'm not sure I'm ready to let them decide again, even if this time the story is better. Then we won't let them decide, Cale said, with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who had spent 3 years learning exactly how much authority he actually held. Whatever comes next, Alira, you'll have a say in it, I promise you that. It was, Alira realized, the first promise anyone had made to her in 7 years that she found herself inclined to believe. Neither of them yet knew how quickly that promise would be tested, or how many people within Thornwood, and beyond it, stood to lose everything the moment the truth of Alira's bloodline became known. But for this single, suspended moment, standing together in the quiet hall, with the afternoon light falling warm across both their faces, neither of them was thinking about danger at all. They were thinking only of each other, and of a bond neither had asked for, but neither, now that it had arrived, found themselves willing to release. News traveled through Thornwood faster than fire through dry grass. By the following morning, whispers of what had happened in the central hall had reached every corner of the pack, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until the truth barely resembled itself anymore. Some said the Alpha King had claimed the scarred woman out of pity. Others said she had used some forbidden trick to trap him, playing on his sympathy to secure a position she had never earned. A few, closer to the truth than they realized, whispered about a hidden bloodline and a sigil no one had ever bothered to look for. Alira felt the shift the moment she stepped outside her small house that morning. Pack members who had spent 7 years looking straight through her now stared openly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to something sharper and less pleasant. Conversations stopped when she passed. Doors that had never quite opened to her now closed even more firmly. "They're afraid," Nadia said later that day, watching from behind her herb stand, as another customer pointedly avoided Alira's mending stall in favor of walking the long way around the square. "People who spent years deciding you were worthless don't know what to do now that you might be worth more than any of them." "I don't want to be worth more than anyone," Alira said quietly, folding a piece of fabric with hands that were not quite steady. "I just want to understand what's happening to me." "That's not a luxury you have anymore," Nadia said, not unkindly. "Not with the Alpha King's attention on you. People will decide what your worth means, whether you want them to or not." Nadia was right, and Alira knew it, though the knowledge did nothing to make the growing unease in her chest any easier to carry. By midday, Elder Corwin had summoned her to a private meeting, his expression carrying none of the reluctant courtesy he had shown during the inspection days earlier. "Is it true," he asked, without preamble, the moment she entered his office, "the rumors that the Alpha King believes you carry first bloodline blood?" "I don't know what I believe yet," Alira said carefully. "The Alpha King discovered something beneath my scar. He believes it to be a sigil connected to an old lineage. Beyond that, I have no answers." Corwin studied her for a long moment, and Alira watched calculation move behind his eyes, the same kind of careful political assessment she had watched him apply to every decision affecting Thornwood's standing among the unified territories. "If this is true," he said slowly, "it changes a great deal. Thornwood's position, our standing with the Alpha King, the resources we might be allocated going forward. A pack that produced a first bloodline descendant would hold considerable prestige." "I'm not a resource for Thornwood to leverage," Alira said, sharper than she intended. "No," Corwin agreed, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe his own words. "Of course not. But you understand, Alira, that others in this pack will not see it that way. Some will resent what they perceive as sudden, unearned fortune. Others will seek to attach themselves to your rising position for their own benefit. You should prepare yourself for both." Alira left Corwin's office with a knot of anxiety settling deep in her stomach, and the following days proved his warning entirely accurate. Within a week, she began noticing a pattern in the pack's shifting attention. Families who had never once acknowledged her existence now approached with sudden, transparent warmth, offering favors, gifts, invitations to gatherings she had spent 7 years excluded from. Alira recognized the calculation behind each gesture immediately, and it left her feeling more isolated in some ways than her years of genuine invisibility had. Worse than the sudden false friendliness was the resentment that simmered beneath the surface among certain pack members, particularly among families who had spent years positioning their own unmated daughters as potential matches for powerful alphas. Alira caught fragments of bitter conversation more than once as she moved through the village, quick and cutting words that stopped the moment she came within earshot, but left their meaning clear enough regardless. The scarred girl. Getting everything handed to her because of a mark no one can even see. She probably paid someone to plant that story. The king will lose interest once the novelty wears off. Mark my words. Alira tried not to let the whispers reach her, but 7 years of careful self-protection had left her particularly sensitive to exactly this kind of quiet cruelty. And by the end of the first week, she found herself questioning things she had felt with absolute certainty in the quiet privacy of the central hall. What if Corwin is right? She asked Kale one evening, when he sought her out at her small house under the pretense of discussing territorial integration, though both of them understood the visit had little to do with politics. What if this is all just convenient timing? What if you only feel drawn to me because of what I might represent, rather than because of anything real between us? Kale's expression sharpened, something protective flashing behind his pale eyes. Is that what you believe? I don't know what I believe, Alira admitted, echoing the same words she had given Corwin days earlier, though the uncertainty felt entirely different when directed at Kale. I spent 7 years convincing myself that being unclaimed was a kind of freedom. Now everyone around me is suddenly deciding I have value, and I can't tell if any of it is real, or if it's all just people rearranging themselves around a bloodline that hasn't even been formally confirmed yet. The bond between us has nothing to do with your bloodline, Kale said, his voice low and certain. I felt it before I knew anything about the sigil, when our hands touched at the market stall, days before either of us understood what your scar was actually hiding. That wasn't calculation, Alira. That was instinct. The same instinct wolves have trusted for generations, long before politics and prestige ever entered the picture. I want to believe that, Alira said quietly. Then believe it, Kale said, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his thumbs tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. I've spent 3 years building walls around myself, convinced that trust was a weakness that had already cost me everything once. I didn't choose to feel this way about you, Alira. If anything, it terrifies me more than any rival I've ever faced. But I'm not walking away from it, and I need you to understand that this isn't about your bloodline, or Thornwood's prestige, or anything except you. Alira felt tears prick at her eyes, 7 years of careful emotional armor cracking further under the weight of his sincerity. I'm afraid, she admitted, the confession costing her more than she expected it to. Not of you. Of everyone around us who suddenly wants something from me, or wants to take something from me, and I don't know how to tell the difference anymore. You won't have to figure it out alone, Kale said. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. It was a comforting promise, and Alira wanted desperately to believe it would be enough. But neither of them yet understood how quickly Thornwood's simmering resentment would curdle into something far more dangerous than whispered gossip and false friendliness. The threat arrived 3 days later, in the form of a rival alpha named Silas Draven, who ruled a neighboring territory that had, until recently, hoped to secure its own alliance with Kale through a carefully arranged match between the Alpha King and Silas's own daughter, a woman named Freya, who had been groomed since childhood for exactly this purpose. Silas arrived in Thornwood uninvited, his retinue considerably larger and more heavily armed than diplomatic courtesy required, and requested an audience with Kale under the pretense of discussing regional trade agreements. Alira, present at Kale's side by then, felt the tension in the room shift the moment Silas entered, his sharp eyes cataloging her presence with obvious, calculated interest. Alpha King, Silas said, offering a bow that carried just enough insolence to register as deliberate. I've heard fascinating rumors regarding your recent discovery. His gaze slid pointedly toward Alira, a hidden bloodline, hiding beneath 7 years of misunderstood injury. Quite the fortunate turn of events. State your business, Silas, Kale said, his voice carrying an edge that made several pack members present shift uncomfortably. My business is simple, Silas said, his smile not quite reaching his cold eyes. Concern, Alpha King. Concern that a claim of this magnitude made so conveniently after 7 years of a woman being deemed entirely unremarkable by her own pack, might warrant closer scrutiny before it's accepted as fact. Bloodlines have been fabricated before, for far less valuable prizes than a position beside the Alpha King. "Are you accusing Alira of deception?" Kale asked, his tone dropping dangerously low. "I'm suggesting caution," Silas said smoothly. "Nothing more. Surely a king as careful as yourself would want independent verification of such an extraordinary claim, rather than relying solely on his own personal interest in the matter." The insinuation landed exactly as intended, and Alira felt her face heat with fury and humiliation in equal measure. Around the hall, she could see pack members exchanging glances, the seeds of doubt Silas had planted already taking root in expressions that had, until moments earlier, seemed at least cautiously accepting of the situation. "I don't need your suggestions regarding matters that don't concern you," Kale said coldly. "But if independent verification would ease the concerns you've so generously volunteered, I have no objection to it. Alira has nothing to hide." "Wonderful," Silas said, his smile widening in a way that made Alira's instincts prickle with warning. "I happen to know of a scholar, well-versed in the old bloodlines, currently residing not far from here. I would be happy to arrange his services, entirely at my own expense, as a gesture of goodwill toward Thornwood's continued alliance with the unified territories." The offer sounded generous on its surface, and several pack members present, including Corwin, murmured approval at the apparent diplomatic courtesy. But Alira caught the flash of something calculating behind Silas's eyes as he made the offer, and beside her, she felt Kale's body go tense with the same suspicion. "That won't be necessary," Kale said. "I'm capable of arranging my own verification, through scholars I trust personally." Silas's smile did not waver, though something colder settled behind it. "Of course, Alpha King, as you wish." He bowed again, the same insolent courtesy as before, and made his exit shortly after, though not before his gaze found Alira once more, lingering with an intensity that left her feeling as though she had just been marked for something far more dangerous than mere social scrutiny. "He means to move against us," Kale said quietly, once Silas and his retinue had departed. "That was not a simple visit of concern, Alira. That was a warning." "What does he want?" Alira asked. "Everything he stood to gain through his daughter's arranged match with me," Kale said grimly. "And now that those plans have been disrupted, he'll do whatever it takes to either discredit your bloodline claim or eliminate the threat you represent to his ambitions entirely." Alira felt a chill settle deep in her bones at the word eliminate, 7 years of careful survival instincts sharpening into something closer to genuine fear. She had spent so long believing that being unclaimed made her safe, invisible, beneath anyone's notice or concern. Now, in the span of a single week, she had become visible in the most dangerous way possible. Valuable enough to be a target, without yet having the power or position to properly defend herself against whatever came next. "I won't let him touch you," Kale said, reading the fear in her expression with unsettling accuracy. "Whatever Silas is planning, we'll be ready for it." Alira wanted to believe him. But as she watched Silas's retinue disappear down the northern road, their departure feeling less like a resolution and more like the opening move of a much larger conflict, she understood, with growing certainty, that the quiet, invisible life she had spent 7 years building had ended for good, replaced by something far more perilous than she had ever imagined possible. A week passed without further word from Silas Draven, and Alira allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that his visit had been nothing more than an empty display of posturing, a rival alpha's wounded pride lashing out before retreating to lick its wounds. Kale was not so easily reassured. "Silas doesn't make threats. He doesn't intend to follow through on," he told her one evening, as they walked the quiet perimeter of Thornwood's territory together, a habit that had become, in the weeks since the inspection, something close to routine. "His silence isn't retreat, Alira. It's preparation." "Preparation for what?" Alira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer would not comfort her. "I don't know yet," Kale admitted. "But I've doubled the guard around your house, and I want you to avoid traveling anywhere alone until we understand what he's planning."
Alira bristled slightly at the restriction, 7 years of hard-won independence rebelling against the idea of needing protection at all.
I've survived on my own for 7 years, Kale. I don't need to be guarded like something fragile. This isn't about fragility, Kale said, stopping and turning to face her fully, his gray eyes serious in the fading evening light. Silas is dangerous, precisely because he's patient. He won't come at you directly, not in a way that could be traced back to him. He'll look for the smallest crack, the smallest moment you're unguarded, and he'll exploit it without hesitation. I'm not asking you to be fragile. I'm asking you to be careful, because I've already lost people I trusted to exactly this kind of patient, calculated cruelty, and I refuse to lose you the same way. The rare vulnerability in his voice softened Alira's resistance considerably. She had learned, in the weeks since their bond had formed, that Kale rarely spoke of the betrayal that had destroyed his first pack, and on the few occasions the subject arose, it always carried this same current of carefully controlled pain beneath his otherwise unshakable composure. "All right," she said finally. "I'll be careful." She kept that promise for exactly 6 more days, until the afternoon, Nadia fell suddenly and severely ill, and a young pack runner arrived at Alira's door, insisting that the older woman was asking for her specifically, too weak to be moved from her small house at the far edge of the territory. Alira did not hesitate. Nadia had been one of the only people in Thornwood to treat her with genuine kindness throughout 7 years of isolation, and the thought of her suffering alone, even briefly, overrode every careful instinct Kale had spent the past weeks reinforcing. She followed the runner through Thornwood's winding paths, moving quickly in the gathering dusk, and it was not until they had traveled well beyond the usual boundaries of the village, deep enough into the surrounding woods, that the familiar sounds of pack life had faded entirely into unsettling silence. That Alira's instincts finally caught up with her racing concern for Nadia's well-being. "This isn't the way to Nadia's house," she said, slowing her pace and studying the runner more carefully. He was young, unfamiliar, someone she did not recognize from Thornwood's usual pack members at all. The runner's expression shifted, the anxious urgency he had displayed at her door replaced by something colder and more calculating. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." Alira's blood ran cold with immediate, instinctive understanding. She turned to run, but 3 additional figures emerged from the surrounding trees before she managed more than a few steps, cutting off every direction of escape with the practiced coordination of people who had planned this ambush carefully in advance. "Alira Voss," said a woman, stepping forward from among the group, her expression carrying none of the false urgency the runner had used to lure Alira from the safety of the village. "Lord Draven sends his regards." "Nadia," Alira said, her voice shaking despite her effort to sound steady. "Is she?" "Perfectly healthy," the woman said, almost amused by the question. "The illness was a fiction, arranged specifically to draw you away from the Alpha King's protection. I confess I didn't expect it to work quite so easily." Fury and fear tangled together in Alira's chest as the full scope of the deception settled over her. She had walked directly into exactly the kind of trap Kale had warned her about, her own compassion for Nadia exploited with precise, deliberate cruelty. "What does Silas want?" she demanded, backing away slowly as the group closed in, her mind racing through every possible avenue of escape and finding none. "Verification," the woman said, her smile carrying the same cold calculation Silas himself had displayed during his visit to Thornwood. "Lord Draven remains skeptical of your claimed bloodline, and he's arranged for a rather more thorough examination than the Alpha King was willing to permit." "You're going to hurt me," Alira said, understanding arriving with sickening clarity. "Only as much as necessary," the woman said, entirely unbothered by the admission, "though I suspect, once we've confirmed whether that scar of yours truly hides anything of value, Lord Draven may decide the simplest solution to his current problem is to ensure you never have the opportunity to claim your bloodline publicly at all." Alira's heart pounded with pure animal terror, 7 years of careful survival instincts screaming at her to run, despite the impossibility of escape. She backed further away, searching desperately for any weakness in the circle closing around her, any opening she might exploit. She found none. The runner lunged first, grabbing her arm with bruising force, and Alira fought back with everything her 7 years of hard-earned wariness had taught her, twisting and clawing and refusing to make herself an easy target, even as the numbers arrayed against her made the outcome feel increasingly, terrifyingly inevitable. She managed to land one solid strike against the runner's jaw, buying herself a single precious second of freedom before the woman who had spoken first seized her from behind, an arm locking hard across Alira's throat, cutting off her air and her ability to call for help in the same brutal motion. Just as darkness began creeping into the edges of Alira's vision, a sound tore through the surrounding forest that made every one of her attackers freeze in place, a deep, furious howl that carried unmistakable authority even through the growing haze of Alira's fading consciousness. Kale. He had not needed to hear her call out. The bond between them, still new and barely understood, had apparently carried enough of her fear and danger across whatever distance separated them to bring him running, and within seconds of the howl, he burst through the tree line, with a speed and violence that scattered Alira's attackers before they fully understood what had descended upon them. The arm around Alira's throat released as her captor turned to face this new, far more dangerous threat, and Alira collapsed to her knees, gasping desperately for air while chaos erupted around her. She had little clear memory of what followed, her vision still swimming from oxygen deprivation, but she registered flashes of movement, snarled commands, the sounds of a fight resolved with brutal, decisive speed by a man who had spent 3 years learning exactly how to protect what mattered to him. When her vision finally cleared enough to focus, Alira found herself in Kale's arms, his hands cradling her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence she had just witnessed, his gray eyes scanning her with desperate, urgent concern. "Alira," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Alira, look at me. Are you hurt?" "I'm all right," she managed, her voice hoarse from the pressure that had been applied to her throat. "Nadia, they said Nadia was ill, but it was a lie, and Nadia is fine," Kale said quickly, understanding immediately. "I checked on her the moment the guard reported you'd left the village. She's perfectly healthy and worried sick about you." Relief washed through Alira, alongside the lingering adrenaline of the attack, and she found herself trembling, 7 years of carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of everything that had happened. Kale pulled her close, holding her steady as the shaking overtook her, his own composure visibly strained despite his obvious effort to remain calm for her sake. "I should have listened to you," she whispered against his chest. "I should have been more careful." "You went to help someone you care about," Kale said, his voice gentler now, though anger still simmered beneath the surface, directed entirely at the people responsible for the ambush, rather than at her. "That's not a failure, Alira. That's exactly the kind of person you are, and I would never want you to become someone who stops caring for others out of fear." "Silas orchestrated this," Alira said, once she had steadied herself enough to speak clearly. "The woman who caught me said as much. He wants to confirm whether my bloodline is real, and if it is," she trailed off, unable to finish the thought aloud. "I know what he wants," Kale said grimly, his jaw tightening with barely contained fury. "This ends now, Alira. I've given Silas every opportunity to withdraw his interference peacefully, and he's answered that patience by trying to have you killed. That's a mistake he won't get the chance to make twice." Around them, Kale's warriors had subdued the remaining attackers, though Alira noted with a mixture of relief and unease that the woman who had spoken to her, the one who had orchestrated the entire deception, had escaped into the surrounding forest during the chaos of Kale's arrival. "She got away," Alira said. "She'll carry word back to Silas of exactly how badly this attempt has failed," Kale said. "Let her. He needs to understand, in no uncertain terms, precisely what consequences await him for threatening you again." Kale helped Alira to her feet, keeping a steadying arm around her, as they made their way back toward the village, his warriors falling into formation around them with the alert, watchful posture of soldiers anticipating further conflict. Alira leaned into his support more than her pride would have permitted weeks earlier. 7 years of fierce independence, tempered, at least for tonight, by genuine, bone-deep exhaustion and fear. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, as the lights of Thornwood's village came into view ahead of them. "Now," Kale said, his voice carrying the same absolute certainty he had shown during their conversation weeks earlier in the central hall. "We stop hiding what you are, and we make it impossible for Silas, or anyone else, to threaten you without answering directly to me. You've spent 7 years being invisible for your own protection, Alira. That protection has run out. It's time the entire region understood exactly who you are, and exactly what will happen to anyone who threatens you again. Alira felt a complicated mixture of relief and apprehension at the prospect. 7 years of careful invisibility, giving way to something entirely unfamiliar. But as she looked up at Cale's determined expression, at the fierce protectiveness burning behind his pale gray eyes, she found herself trusting, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. The attack in the woods had been meant to break her, to prove her claimed bloodline false, or eliminate the threat it represented entirely. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had forged, in the space of a single terrifying evening, an unshakable resolve in both Alira and Cale that Silas Draven's calculated cruelty would not go unanswered, and that whatever price his ambition demanded, he would be the one paying it in the days to come. 3 of Silas's captured attackers were brought before Cale the following morning, and under his measured but unyielding questioning, they confirmed everything Alira had already suspected. Silas Draven had ordered the ambush personally, intending to either extract a confession that Alira's bloodline claim was fabricated, or, failing that, to ensure she never lived long enough to have it formally recognized. He fears what her recognition would mean for his own ambitions, one of the captured attackers admitted, his earlier defiance crumbling under the weight of Cale's cold, unwavering authority. With his daughter's match to you no longer possible, and a first bloodline descendant standing beside you instead, his territory's influence among the unified packs would fall drastically. He couldn't allow that to happen. Cale's expression remained carefully controlled throughout the questioning, but Alira, standing beside him, could feel the barely restrained fury radiating from him like heat from a forge. When the confessions concluded, he turned to Elder Corwin, his voice carrying the flat, absolute authority of a king whose patience had entirely run out. "Summon every pack within a day's travel," he said. "I want representatives here within 3 days. It's time Silas Draven answered publicly for what he's attempted." Word of the ambush spread even faster than the earlier rumors of Alira's bloodline had, and by the time representatives from the surrounding territories began arriving in Thornwood, the entire region buzzed with anticipation of a confrontation few had expected to witness so soon after Cale's unification efforts had begun. Silas arrived on the appointed day with considerably more confidence than the situation likely warranted, his retinue arranged behind him with the same insolent posture he had displayed during his first visit weeks earlier. If he felt any concern about the confessions his captured attackers had already provided, he concealed it well behind a mask of wounded indignation. "Alpha King," he said, offering the same shallow, insolent bow as before. "I understand there have been troubling accusations circulating regarding my involvement in some unfortunate incident. I assure you, I have no knowledge of—" "Save your denials," Cale interrupted, his voice cutting through the gathered crowd with unmistakable authority. 3 of your own people have already confessed, in detail, to the ambush ordered against Alira Voss 6 days ago. This is not a negotiation, Silas. This is a reckoning." Murmurs rippled through the assembled representatives, and Alira, standing at Cale's side in a position of visible prominence she would have found unimaginable mere weeks earlier, felt the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes settling upon her. She kept her chin lifted, her hair swept back fully from her face, the scar and the hidden sigil beneath it fully visible for anyone who cared to look. Silas's composure finally cracked, though only briefly, replaced by something colder and more calculating as he recognized the trap closing around him. "Even if such an incident occurred," he said carefully, "it would hardly warrant this level of spectacle. A private matter, easily resolved through appropriate compensation, surely. Attempted murder of a first bloodline descendant is not a private matter," Cale said. "And speaking of bloodlines, since you demanded verification so insistently during your last visit, I've arranged exactly that." He gestured, and a woman Alira had not previously met stepped forward from among the gathered representatives, elderly and dignified, wearing robes marked with symbols Alira did not recognize, but suspected carried significant weight among those who understood such things. "This is Mira Thessaly," Kale announced to the assembled crowd. "Scholar of the old bloodlines, summoned from beyond our territories specifically to provide independent verification, exactly as Silas himself suggested was necessary." Mira approached Alira with unhurried, careful steps, studying her scarred cheek with the same intense focus Kale had shown weeks earlier in the quiet privacy of the central hall. She raised a weathered hand and traced the pattern beneath the scar tissue exactly as Kale had, and Alira felt the same warmth spread beneath her touch, the sigil responding with quiet, unmistakable recognition. "The sigil of the first bloodline," Mira announced to the gathered crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the silent square. "I have studied bloodline markings for over 40 years, and I can confirm without hesitation that this mark is genuine, ancient, and entirely authentic. Alira Voss descends directly from the founding lineage of the earliest packs." The crowd erupted into a wave of astonished murmurs, and Alira felt the weight of the moment settle over her with a strange combination of vindication and overwhelming exposure. 7 years of being told she was worthless, unwanted, unclaimable, had just been publicly and irrefutably contradicted, in front of representatives from every territory within a day's travel of Thornwood. "There," Kale said, turning back to Silas, whose earlier confidence had drained entirely from his expression. "Your demanded verification, provided in full. The bloodline is genuine, which means your attempt to eliminate Alira was not merely an act of violence against an innocent woman, but a calculated attempt to destroy a legitimate claim to first bloodline heritage, purely to protect your own diminished ambitions." "This is absurd," Silas said, though the conviction had entirely left his voice. "I demand." "You are in no position to demand anything," Kale said, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous that silenced the remaining murmurs throughout the square entirely. "You ordered an attack against a woman under my protection. You attempted to have her killed to preserve your own political standing. Under the laws governing the unified territories, this is an act of war against my rule, and I intend to treat it as exactly that." Silas's retinue shifted uneasily around him, several of his own warriors exchanging glances that suggested they had not fully understood the risk their alpha had exposed them to when he ordered the ambush. Silas himself seemed to recognize, finally, the full scope of the trap he had walked into, his earlier arrogance replaced by the desperate calculation of a man searching for any remaining escape. "I acted to protect my territory's future," Silas said, his voice rising with a mixture of anger and genuine fear. "You cannot fault me for defending my people's interests against an unproven claim that threatened everything I've built." "The claim was proven the moment you sent people to silence it before it could be examined honestly," Kale said. "That's not the action of a man confident in his own position, Silas. That's the action of a man who already knew, deep down, that the truth would not favor him, and chose violence rather than accept it." The gathered representatives watched this exchange with rapt, silent attention, and Alira could see, in the shifting expressions across the crowd, the political tide turning decisively against Silas, as the full weight of his miscalculation became apparent to everyone present. "What is your judgment, Alpha King?" Corwin asked quietly, breaking the tense silence. Kale was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on Silas with an intensity that made the other Alpha visibly flinch. "Silas Draven's territory will be absorbed fully into the unified territories, under direct governance until such time as trust can be rebuilt through demonstrated good faith," he announced finally, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Silas himself will surrender his authority immediately. Those who followed his orders in the attack against Alira will face judgment, according to the laws governing violence against protected citizens of the unified territories." The pronouncement landed like a physical blow across the assembled crowd, and Silas, understanding at last that his ambitions had cost him everything he had spent years building, sank to his knees, his earlier arrogance entirely extinguished. "Please," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "My daughter, my people, they had no part in this decision." "Your daughter and your people will be protected and integrated fairly," Kale said, some of the harshness leaving his voice, though his authority remained absolute. "This judgment falls on you alone, Silas, for the choices you made. Had you approached this situation with honesty rather than calculated cruelty, we might have found a peaceful resolution. Instead, you chose violence against someone who had done nothing to deserve it, and that choice has consequences you alone must bear. Silas's warriors moved forward at Kale's silent signal, taking their former alpha into custody, with expressions that suggested relief rather than resistance at the change in leadership his downfall represented. As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with the shock of everything they had witnessed, Illyra found herself standing quietly at the center of the emptying square, overwhelmed by the sudden, dramatic shift her life had undergone in the span of a single confrontation. 7 years of careful invisibility, unmade entirely in a matter of weeks, replaced by a truth so significant it had just reshaped the political landscape of an entire region. "Are you all right?" Kale asked quietly, moving to stand beside her once the last of the representatives had departed, his earlier fierce authority softening back into the gentler warmth she had come to know in their private moments together. "I don't know," Illyra admitted honestly. "Everything happened so quickly. A week ago I was mending fabric at a market stall that half the pack avoided out of discomfort. Now she gestured vaguely at the empty square, at the weight of everything that had just transpired. I don't even know what I am now." "You're exactly who you've always been," Kale said gently, taking her hands in his. "The bloodline doesn't change your character, Illyra. It doesn't change your kindness, or your strength, or the quiet dignity you've carried through 7 years of a world that refused to see your worth. All it changes is whether the rest of the world is finally willing to acknowledge what was true about you all along." Illyra felt tears prick at her eyes, 7 years of carefully suppressed emotion finally finding an outlet in the safety of this quiet, private moment. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, for protecting me, for seeing past the scar to something I'd almost convinced myself wasn't there at all." "I never saw past the scar," Kale said, reaching up to trace the mark along her cheek with the same reverent gentleness he had shown weeks earlier, when his lips had first touched it in the quiet privacy of the central hall. "I saw you, Illyra, scar included, exactly as you are. That's all I've ever seen, from the very first moment you lifted your head during the inspection and refused to look away." The confrontation with Silas had ended in decisive victory, the threat to Illyra's safety neutralized, and her bloodline publicly, irrefutably confirmed. But as Illyra stood in the quiet aftermath beside the man whose bond had upended and ultimately transformed her entire understanding of herself, she understood that the truest test still lay ahead, not the danger of external enemies, but the far more delicate challenge of learning to step fully into a life and identity she had spent 7 years convinced she would never be permitted to claim. Weeks passed, and Thornwood slowly settled into a new rhythm shaped by everything that had happened. Silas's former territory had been absorbed peacefully into the unified lands under Kale's direct oversight, and word of the confrontation had traveled far beyond the immediate region, carrying with it the story of a scarred woman who had turned out to be far more than anyone had ever believed possible. Illyra found the attention difficult to adjust to at first. 7 years of practiced invisibility did not unravel overnight, simply because the truth of her bloodline had been publicly confirmed. She still caught herself, some mornings, reaching instinctively for her hair to pull it forward over the left side of her face, an old habit her body remembered, even after her mind had begun to release the shame that had once demanded it. "You don't have to do that anymore," Kale observed gently one morning, catching her mid-gesture as they walked together through the village, now populated with pack members, who greeted her with genuine warmth, rather than the careful avoidance she had grown so accustomed to. "Old habits," Illyra said, lowering her hand with a small, self-conscious smile. 7 years is a long time to practice hiding. It doesn't disappear, just because the reason for it has." "No," Kale agreed, "but you don't have to carry it alone anymore either." Their relationship, forged in the strange, sudden fire of an unexpected bond, had deepened steadily in the weeks following Silas's downfall, moving past the initial uncertainty and fear that had shadowed its earliest days into something Illyra was only beginning to trust as genuinely, permanently solid. Kale had insisted, despite the political pressure from various territories eager to formalize their union quickly for the sake of stability, that they take whatever time Illyra needed before any formal claiming ceremony took place. "I won't rush you into anything," he had told her, more than once. "You've spent 7 years having decisions made about your life without your consent. I refuse to be one more person who does that to you, regardless of what anyone else expects. It was one of the many things Alira had come to treasure about him, this careful, deliberate respect for her autonomy that stood in such stark contrast to the pack politics that had governed so much of her earlier life. And so, rather than rushing toward a hasty ceremony meant to satisfy political expectation, they had instead spent the weeks getting to properly know each other, outside the pressure of inspection halls and public confrontations, learning the smaller, quieter truths about one another that no bloodline record or political alliance could reveal. Alira learned that Kale, despite his fearsome reputation, possessed a dry, understated sense of humor he rarely displayed publicly, and a genuine, careful patience with the pack children who had begun, in the weeks since Silas's downfall, to trail after him during his walks through the village, fascinated by stories of the powerful Alpha King who had defeated a rival territory to protect someone they had all once overlooked. Kale, in turn, learned that Alira's quiet reserve, the same careful stillness that had once helped her survive 7 years of isolation, concealed a sharp wit and an unshakable moral compass that made her instinctively protective of anyone in the pack who found themselves overlooked or dismissed the way she once had been. She began, gradually, using her newfound standing not for personal advantage, but to advocate for pack members who had spent years being quietly ignored the way she once was, and Kale found himself, more than once, adjusting territorial policy based entirely on concerns she raised on behalf of people who would otherwise have had no voice at all. "You could ask for anything," he told her one evening, genuinely curious, as they sat together near the edge of the woods where she had once fled, after the night a knife had nearly ended everything before it began. "Wealth, status, whatever you wanted. Instead, you're spending your influence advocating for an elderly widow's grazing rights." "I know what it feels like to be unseen," Alira said simply. "I don't need more than I already have, but I can make sure fewer people in this pack have to feel invisible the way I did." It was, Kale thought, watching her in the fading evening light, one of the clearest examples of exactly why the bond between them had formed in the first place, not because of prestige, or bloodline, or political convenience, but because of a character forged through hardship into something quietly, unshakably good. The formal claiming ceremony, when it finally arrived some months later, drew representatives from every territory within the unified lands, all eager to witness the joining of the Alpha King to a woman whose story had, by then, become something close to legend throughout the region. Alira stood at the center of Thornwood's grand hall, dressed simply but elegantly, her hair swept back fully to reveal the scar and the sigil beneath it, without a trace of the shame that had once governed every choice she made about her own appearance. Kale stood before her, his pale gray eyes carrying none of the cold, careful neutrality he had worn during their first meeting at the inspection so many months earlier, replaced instead by an open warmth that few people beyond Alira herself had ever been permitted to witness. "7 years ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, addressing not just Alira, but the assembled representatives who had traveled to witness this moment, "this pack decided that a scar made a woman worthless. They were wrong, and their mistake nearly cost this region someone whose courage, wisdom, and unshakable integrity have already begun reshaping what these unified territories can become. I do not claim Alira Voss despite her scar. I claim her because of everything that scar represents: survival against impossible odds, dignity in the face of cruelty, and a strength that no wound, visible or otherwise, could ever diminish." Alira felt tears rise in her eyes, 7 years of pain finally finding resolution in this single, public acknowledgement of everything she had endured, and everything she had, against every expectation, become. "I spent 7 years believing that being unclaimed was the only freedom available to me," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "I was wrong too. Real freedom isn't found in hiding from a world that refuses to see your worth. It's found in standing before that world exactly as you are, scars included, and refusing to let anyone else's fear or cruelty define what you're capable of becoming." As Kale reached up and traced the scar along her cheek one final time before the ceremony's completion, the same gentle gesture he had first offered in the quiet privacy of the central hall so many months earlier, Illyra felt the last remnants of 7 years of carefully constructed invisibility fall away entirely, replaced by a certainty she had never once believed she would be permitted to feel. She was not damaged, she was not unclaimable. She had never, despite everything the world had told her, been anything less than exactly enough. The assembled crowd erupted into celebration as the ceremony concluded, and somewhere among the joyful noise, Nadia caught Illyra's eye from across the hall, offering a proud, knowing smile that needed no words to convey its meaning. Illyra smiled back, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely, unapologetically visible. Outside the grand hall, evening settled gently over Thornwood, the same territory that had once dismissed her as unworthy now transformed, through her own quiet strength and Cale's unwavering devotion, into a place where scars were understood not as marks of shame, but as evidence of survival, and where being truly seen, at last, had become the greatest freedom of all.